Unity was something that was important to me as a young minister in the Churches of Christ, circa 1990s and on into the early aughts. My stories that are extremely personalized, and none of them are exactly earth shattering, but they were formidable to my faith walk. There were moments where me as an introvert was moved to open up to other people, and a lot of good came from it. So maybe it will inspire someone out there to open up to others and act upon the idea that it is Christ who unifies people, not our own agreement with each other. The most important aspect of agreement is to agree with God. So I have a few stories about some of the events that led me into being passionate about unity and some that I helped to get started. And then I'll close with some comments. First thing you got to do is to define unity. As I've grown older, my scope of what the definition is has certainly broadened. But back in those days, it was way simpler. It was limited in scope to the local churches of Christ. I grew up in Valdosta, Georgia, and the Church of Christ there has got an interest in history. I even covered some of the details of that segment of the Restoration history for my master's thesis. During the late 80s, when I was in high school in that town, the Churches of Christ didn't exactly have a lot of cohesion. The congregation that I attended, because my dad was an employee through the mission work that they sponsored there, sort of played themselves like they were the only faithful congregation in town. And there was nothing really concrete about what made the other congregations outside the scope of what the leaders considered faithful, but it was certainly a real thing, the division there. One of the personal stories that was related to my interest being piqued in congregations getting along more happened at a public high school. I had gone to the school all year, and since I was new that year, I didn't really have a whole lot of friends. And then towards the end of the year, I heard this couple of girls that I didn't know, they were talking about going to the Church of Christ across town. And what hit me was how it would have been so good to know that these guys were my sisters in Christ, and maybe I wouldn't have felt so lonely in this big old high school. And once I got into youth ministry a few years later, I simply wanted to give younger students an opportunity that I didn't have when I was going through high school, and that was the opportunity to hang out with kids from other congregations in the area, if anything, just to get to know them and recognize their faces. The way that this desire to get people together manifested itself was I was blessed enough to come back to my hometown after being trained in the Bible with two different churches where I served as the summer youth minister. When I was called into youth ministry, I called everybody else that was in youth ministry in the area to gather at a local restaurant to float the possibility that we could possibly have an area-wide youth meeting. I don't think that this is anything that the local leaders who were in place at the time would have ever agreed to or organized if it hadn't been for the young guy who didn't know any better organizing it to make it happen. So despite all the negative politics that was going on, we did some youth group get-togethers that summer. The last meeting of the summer, over 300 people were there, and all the churches were working together on some level, and it was good times, and they actually continued that for a few more years after that. So another offspring of those initial steps in the unity movements, which maybe should be renamed internal fellowship cooperations, the next step was getting preachers together in that area for lunch once a month. I don't know if it has continued since those days, but in that time period, it was a good thing, and I was glad to have been a part of it. In the late 90s, I was kind of flying under the radar a bit on the ministry side, but around the year 2000, I was in Montgomery, Alabama, finishing up my master's thesis. Montgomery's not very different than a lot of the other cities that I've been in concerning the lack of unity amongst churches of Christ in the area. And Montgomery may have even been worse. A lot of hostility between what some in that day would have classified the more conservative and the more liberal churches, using the weasel words of that day. Philosophically, years earlier, I had decided that I was not going to have a dog in that fight. But even when I was in school, I didn't take the classes on denominational doctrines because I figured if you were attached to the Word that you didn't have to worry about false teachings. You know, the kind of vibe of catching counterfeits. You don't have to know what all the counterfeits are. You just have to know what the real thing looks like. So I was friends with preachers primarily in the early 2000s in Montgomery, Alabama. You know, you have the common life and career, and it gives you a camaraderie with people who are in the same calling. So I wasn't at a church at the time as a minister, but I had visited around to several of them in the area during that time. And they were all across that spectrum. The way that I was treated by both sides whenever the others knew that I was visiting around was very interesting. The more progressive minister simply said that he missed me when I wasn't there, and he was always talking about some of the positive things that they were doing that I would probably want to be a part of. The conservative minister actually wrote me a letter of concern to tell me why I probably shouldn't be going to that other congregation. So at that moment in time, I had one of the most unique positions of being friends with both of those guys, literally having lunch with one of them and dinner with the other on the same day. And I still consider both of them dear friends, and, you know, leads me to the idea that you don't have to abandon your friends just because they go to a different church than you do. One of the next places that I ministered as a preacher was in Savannah, Georgia. And that town had been wrecked in previous years in the Church of Christ Fellowship by scandals and various degrees of what I would classify as ultra-exclusivists, some of whom never really wanted to have any fellowship with any of the others anyway. But those who did, I believe, enjoyed the fellowship, and it certainly led to some area-wide cooperation meetings that were relationship building and very positive for the Church of Christ Fellowship in the Gulf Coast region of Georgia. Marshall Keeble, a famous preacher in the Churches of Christ, was criticized one time for calling what Church of Christ people call our denominational friends, he called him a brother. And his answer was that what brother he doesn't have in Christ that he has through Adam. And that's a good point. Internal fellowship meetings gave way in my own life to interdenominational fellowships, and the jump wasn't a real big one to make, but we also have them as brothers in Christ. I've done prison ministry, Trace Diaz ministry, and have had personal fellowships. And then once I got into mission work, when you get to the mission field, everybody are brothers, and you all have the common goal of moving everyone closer to Christ in some kind of way, regardless of your party affiliation. So unity is something that is not so much something that people decide on, but rather it's something that has been achieved in Christ. Like in the parable of the nets, we should consider that we are not fishermen with discernment, but we're just going to cast the nets out there and let the Lord sort them out later. And the purpose of this is to encourage and inspire getting together with other people and having discussions that could cross-pollinate some of the good things and maybe cull out some of the bad, that can help you see something that you never seen before, and be able to entrust your conversations and your connections with other people to the Lord, instead of never having conversations based upon or even someone else's assessment of another group of people. Shalom.